John, Paul, George, Ringo, I give you the one and only fabulous Beatles!
There are artists who change the charts, and then there are artists who change the temperature of the decade. John Lennon did both. He wrote anthems that sounded like private thoughts, and private thoughts that felt like public events, and for a few electric years the world moved at his tempo.
And now your hosts for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
But this isn't just about melodies and fame, it's about timing, friction, and a media world that no longer exists. The conditions that made John Lennon, post-war grit, the birth of youth culture and the crucible of Beatlemania will not happen again. And that's why there will never be another John Lennon. Before the world loved Lennon, Lennon had to learn to survive it. He grew up in a Britain still rationing sugar, where the streets knew silence and resilience in equal measure. John was raised by his Aunt Mimi with a mixture of strict rules and fierce affection, and somewhere between those two poles he learned that wit could be armor. He drew cartoons that made teachers wince, tossed off wordplay that could cut, and wore a smirk like a shield. Under it all was a boy who devoured skiffle and American rock and roll, hearing in those records a kind of freedom that didn't ask permission. The skiffle craze mattered because it lowered the price of admission. You could start a band with a cheap guitar and stubbornness, and Lennon had both. He formed the Quarrymen, and one sticky afternoon in 1957, a friend brought along a younger musician who could tune a guitar while listening sideways and who remembered lyrics Lennon didn't. Paul McCartney watched John bluff through verses he hadn't quite learned and saw not a mistake, but magnetism. Lennon saw a kid who could match him chord for chord and throw in harmonies that seemed to arrive already polished. Partnerships like that aren't products, they're collisions. Paul's melodic discipline met John's crooked grin, and suddenly adolescent noise started aiming at something. They recruited a quiet guitarist named George Harrison who could make a solo feel like a sentence with perfect grammar, and later a drummer named Ringo Starr who played like a song should walk. They were still teenagers, still broke, and already tugging at a future none of them could quite picture.
You've no idea what your plans are for tomorrow?
No, we'd just go and find out, you know.
If Liverpool taught them how to be tough, Hamburg taught them how to be a band. The clubs were long nights and longer sets.
We've been at it a long time before that. We've been to Hamburg. I think that's where we found our style. We developed our style.
The crowds loud and indifferent until you forced them not to be. Lennon learned how to pour swagger across a room and how to laugh off a mistake without losing momentum. By the time they came home, they weren't lucky kids anymore. They were professionals with a reputation that spread faster than the smoke that clung to their coats. Brian Epstein arrived with a different kind of gift. He saw chaos and understood how to aim it. Suits, set lists, appointments kept, press tamed without caging the wildness.
I hadn't had anything to do with pop management of pop artists before that day that I went down to the Cavern Club and heard the Beatles
He
play.
polished the surface and left the spark alone. That combination, raw energy under careful framing, was rare. It would prove essential. What happened next shocked even their closest friends. The Cavern Club wasn't glamorous. It was heat, brick, condensation, and rhythm. But beneath the sweat, there was something undeniable. And word spread until it reached the offices where television schedules were made. In February 1964, the United States gathered in living rooms with rabbit ear antennas and coffee tables that had seen better days. A nation still grieving turned on The Ed Sullivan Show and found 4 young men who looked like trouble and sounded like joy. Lennon's half-sneer, half-smile, the rhythm guitar pounding like a heartbeat, the sideways jokes that made teenagers feel seen. Television turned a local weather event into a cultural front. Beatlemania isn't just a headline, it's logistics. Airport crowds, police escorts, hotel floors turned into fortresses, and flashbulbs that made nights look like thunderstorms. Lennon joked with reporters as if it were a sport.
Now, our host for this evening, the Bony Rolls. And now your hosts for this evening.
Swatting away silly questions with sharp answers, and then, in the next breath, offering a line so gentle it made the room soften. That duality, acerbic and tender, pulled people closer. Even the skeptics had to listen. On stage, the volume was ferocious and often swallowed by the crowd. They invented the modern arena tour while wondering if anyone could hear them over the screaming. Between songs, Lennon would toss off a one-liner, and the noise would crest like a wave hitting a pier. It wasn't sustainable, but it was undeniable. By the mid-1960s, they were not just the biggest band on the planet. They were a moving conversation about what pop music could be. The monoculture mattered. There were only a few channels, a handful of newspapers and radio stations that could turn a single into a national emergency. When Lennon moved, the camera followed. When he spoke, the papers amplified it. That megaphone could make a Tuesday feel like a turning point. It also meant a stumble could echo. Behind the curtain, things looked very different. Context is a fragile thing. In 1966, Lennon remarked that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus.
This is Doug Layton and Tommy Charles. We're reminding you that our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. We have not forgotten what the Beatles said.
Having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus.
A deflationary comment on culture that, once clipped and reprinted, landed like a provocation.
Well, I think the Beatles are a real talented group, but I think that they need to watch what they say because they're in such a position that a lot of teenagers really think of them as something really big, and when they say things like that, some teenagers are going to just believe anything they say.
Radio bans followed. Record burnings followed the bans. The road, which had been a victory lap, started to feel like a gauntlet. The band faced a choice: keep touring and let the noise bend the music, or leave the stage and see what the studio could make possible. They chose the second path, and modern pop followed them. If the stage vanished, the studio became a laboratory. Tape machines were instruments, microphones were microscopes, and songs could sound like dream fragments recorded in color. Lennon chased textures that felt like thoughts: backward guitars, varispeed voices, stacked harmonies that couldn't exist anywhere but inside a pair of headphones. He wrote words that were both confessional and surreal, matching his inner monologue to melodies that refused to behave. This wasn't escape, it was metamorphosis. Without the burden of touring, the band could spend days on a snare sound, could bury a string quartet under a sigh, could decide that a chorus worked better as a distant choir. Lennon's writing sharpened into something both more personal and more oblique. When he sang like a diary, he meant it. When he hid behind imagery, he meant that too. He was not trying to be tidy. He was trying to be true. The controversy that could have broken them instead hardened their resolve. It also pulled Lennon further into the role he was built to play: the artist who says what he thinks and lives with the mess that follows. But that wasn't the full story. Every generation has a way of asking for peace. Lennon and Yoko Ono asked loudly, creatively, and sometimes with a wink that made reporters reach for a second question. The bed-ins weren't stunts so much as performance art with a press pass. They turned the familiar theater of a press conference into a backdrop for something sincere. The message was simple. The method made it unforgettable. Public activism put private strain under a lens. Band business grew complicated. Managers and contracts, friendships turning into paperwork, paperwork turning into arguments. The partnership with Paul McCartney, one of the strangest and most beautiful alignments in pop history, began to splinter under the weight of different instincts and different futures. A line in a song would sound like a letter. A press quote would read like a reply. The public saw a feud. Two men who had once finished each other's musical sentences were learning how to speak alone. Yet, somehow, their shadows stayed linked. Lennon could write a track as raw as a nerve and still hear a counter melody that sounded suspiciously like something Paul might have suggested. Paul could build a cathedral of harmony and leave a crooked window that felt like John. Breaks can be clean on paper and jagged in the mind. Behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. The cameras didn't always feel friendly. In the early 1970s, Lennon's activism and visibility drew intense scrutiny. Immigration battles turned everyday life into appointments and affidavits. At the same time, he pursued a kind of honesty that pop stars usually outsource to songwriters or hide between metaphors. He confronted parts of himself he didn't admire and admitted to failures he didn't want to romanticize. The music mirrored that candor, sometimes plain-spoken to the point of discomfort, sometimes gentle enough to sound like a private apology. There were years later nicknamed the Lost Weekend, a stretch of separation and wandering, of nights that ran long and days that arrived too soon. Friends remember an artist who could be both bright and bruised in the same afternoon, still hilarious, still capable of turning a room with a single remark, and also clearly searching. He collaborated widely, tested versions of himself, and wrote songs that sounded like letters never mailed. The tabloids preferred the mess to the repair, but the repair mattered. Lennon's life edged back toward the kind of stability that doesn't make headlines. He proved that reinvention isn't only a musical word. Sometimes it means telling the truth to yourself and waiting to see who walks with you after you do. And that tenderness would change his priorities. Not many global icons gamble on silence. Lennon did. He stepped back from the loud parts of fame and leaned into the quiet work of family. There are photos from that period that do not look like a legend. They look like a father and a kitchen and a life. Bread rising on a counter, a child asleep in a patch of window light, the city humming below the Dakota while a record player spins in another room. For fans, the pause felt like a cliff edge. For Lennon, it was a steadying ground. He learned the small rituals that fill a day when you're not aiming for applause. He lived a kind of domestic rhythm that can be hard to explain when the world is used to seeing you as a headline. It wasn't an absence of creativity, it was a redirection of it, toward patience, toward attention, toward being present for moments that do not announce themselves. The house husband years changed his voice. When he returned to the studio, you could hear something new. Not a different singer exactly, but a different gaze. But silence would not last forever. When Lennon stepped back into the booth, the song sounded like doors opening. There was warmth in the melodies, clarity in the words, and an ease that comes from knowing what spaces you want to fill and which ones you will leave empty. The harmonies felt domestic in the best sense of the word, two voices understanding each other. The music wasn't trying to outshout the world, it was inviting the world in. Then, in December 1980, on a cold New York night, everything stopped.
He was shot late this evening in front of his apartment building in New York City.
Good evening. The death of a man who sang and played the guitar overshadows the news from Poland, Iran, and Washington tonight. Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night outside his luxury apartment in New York. The alleged killer is an unemployed...
The news moved across radios and television with the strange, heavy slowness of shock. Vigils formed without being planned. People who had grown up with his voice found themselves standing in public squares where the only sound that made sense was singing.
I was very shocked, you know. It's terrible news.
How did you find out about it?
I got a phone call this morning.
From whom?
From a friend of mine.
Mourning turned into a kind of community, and community turned into memory. Grief can turn a person into an icon faster than life ever does, but the records resisted flattening. They kept their edges, the jokes tucked into corners, the anger he refused to varnish, the sudden tenderness that felt like someone pushing a cup of tea toward your hands after a hard day. The best legacies are not statues. They are doorways you walk through again and again. Lennon's work became exactly that. And still, the story wasn't finished. It's tempting to say uniqueness is just talent, as if you could weigh it and measure it and hand it to the next prodigy. Lennon's uniqueness is a layered answer. It begins with timing, a post-war country letting color back in, a youth market discovering its purchasing power, and a media ecosystem small enough to turn one television appearance into a national event. That kind of monoculture could crown and question you in the same week, and Lennon understood both sides of that crown. It continues with chemistry. He and McCartney built a songwriting partnership that remains the reference point for modern pop, not because they always agreed, but because their disagreements built better bridges. Paul's golden architecture framed Lennon's instinct to lean against the railing, to throw in a line that made the whole structure human. You can find other great partnerships. You will not find that one again, in that exact balance, at that exact moment, with those exact tools. It expands with courage. Lennon said what he thought in public and then dealt with the aftermath in public. Sometimes the aftermath looked like applause. Sometimes it looked like a week of outrage and a year of paperwork. He learned, adjusted, apologized, doubled down, and kept writing. That willingness to be complicated in full view of the audience is rarer than we pretend. It doesn't scale well to an era that wants immediate clarity and constant content, and it closes with technology. Today, music finds us through 1,000 tiny funnels. Algorithms are good at patterns and weak at miracles. They can put the right song in your headphones at the right time. They cannot recreate the evening when an entire country turned its head at once to watch 4 young men shake a studio, and with it, a generation. We can restore tapes, remaster film, and even rescue a fragile demo so that a final Beatles song can step back into daylight. What we cannot restore is the exact world that heard Lennon first. The mix of innocence and impatience, scarcity and hunger, hope and television glare. That is why there will never be another John Lennon. Not because talent vanished, but because the stage did. The monoculture dissolved into a sea of channels. The gatekeepers lost their keys, and 1,000,000 doors opened. That can be beautiful. It is democratic and generous. It also means the kind of singular cultural ignition Lennon experienced is now structurally unlikely. We meet our heroes in smaller rooms. He met his in a nation's living room. And yet, the songs still find us. Every few years, the past re-enters the room with better sound. Restored footage makes the colors feel newly mixed. Letters surface that soften our judgments or complicate our conclusions. Friends speak on camera with the kind of affectionate precision that only time can write. Some stories become clearer, others turn hazier, as legends tend to. Through it all, the records keep doing their quiet work. They change as you change. What sounded like rebellion at 16 can sound like compassion at 60. What sounded like a dare becomes a welcome. That is Lennon's final gift. He turned mischief into mercy and sarcasm into solidarity. He took private confusion and shaped it into melodies that could sit beside you while you paid your bills, or washed the dishes, or drove a familiar route on a day when you needed company. He was not perfect. He said so himself. He tried to grow in public, which is a difficult thing to do even when no one is watching. He joked when people expected him to preach and told the truth when people expected him to entertain. And when the culture asked for a neat narrative, he gave it something harder and better, a human one. The channels multiplied, the signals scattered. Yet somewhere, on a turntable that's a little dusty and a little sacred, a needle drops, a guitar chimes, and a voice that was once a shield becomes a welcome. A father tells a child about the night the world stood still, and the child hears a chorus that feels older than anyone in the room. The artist is gone, but the doors he left open are still open. Walk through them, and you're back in the living room with the rabbit ear antennas, or shoulder to shoulder at an arena where the crowd has become the weather, or in a kitchen where bread is rising and a record is humming softly on the counter. There won't be another John Lennon. There doesn't need to be. The one we had keeps finding us, sometimes on the radio, sometimes in a friend's voice, sometimes in our own. And in that sense, the story isn't over. It simply keeps returning, like a familiar melody that sounds new every time you give it your full attention.